The morning of October 1st, 2025 began like any other day in New York City. The traffic roared, the skyline shimmered. Yet, inside the marble chamber of the United Nations, the air was heavy, almost sacred. Flags of 100 nations hung like silent witnesses. Delegates murmured, shuffling their papers, unaware that history was about to take the floor. A young man, not in a designer suit but in a simple olive-green military jacket, rose from his seat. His name, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. A soldier, a believer, a symbol of a continent's restless soul. He looked around the chamber, the guardians of global finance, the architects of debt, the men who measure nations in interest rates. He unfolded a small sheet of paper. Then, without reading it, he looked straight at the representatives of the International Monetary Fund and spoke 7 words that would echo far beyond that room. Africa owes you nothing. The silence that followed was not absence of sound. It was awe. Like thunder waiting for a mountain to answer. For decades, African leaders had bowed politely before these same institutions, pleading for relief, negotiating for crumbs. But not this man, not this voice. Traoré spoke not as a debtor, but as a witness. His words were not about numbers, they were about honor. Some compared him to David facing Goliath. Others whispered another name, Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary of the 1980s who once defied the same powers and paid with his life. Yet this day felt different. The cameras were rolling, the world was listening, and a continent long silenced was finding its voice again. As he spoke, the marble walls of the United Nations seemed to tremble. And so we ask, was this the beginning of Africa's liberation or the first step toward its punishment? Before you decide, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what is the price of dignity? The chairman of the United Nations session cleared his throat, introducing what was supposed to be a routine discussion on debt restructuring for developing nations. But as Traoré stood, the room grew still. The cameras zoomed in. The translators leaned forward. The moment had turned sacred. Traoré didn't begin with greetings or protocol. His first words sliced through the chamber like a blade of truth. "Africa owes you nothing," he said again, his voice steady. "It is you who owe us the truth." Gasps spread across the hall. The IMF delegates froze. Some lowered their eyes, others whispered nervously. For a long time, African leaders had couched their frustrations in careful language, words that wouldn't offend, phrases that begged for mercy. But Traoré's tone carried no apology, only defiance. He began to list what he called the 7 crimes of the IMF in Africa, each one like a verdict in a courtroom that had waited decades for justice. First, he spoke of the debt traps that suffocated Ghana and Ivory Coast. He reminded the world that Ghana, despite its vast gold and cocoa, remained buried under a $3 billion bailout from 2022, with obligations exceeding $2.7 billion special drawing rights. A nation rich in soil, he said, yet poor in freedom. Second, he denounced the privatization of Ghana's cocoa industry. Once the pride of its farmers, it had been handed to foreign corporations. "The farmers who feed the world now survive on crumbs," Traoré declared. "Their sweat builds mansions abroad while their children study under leaking roofs." Third, his tone sharpened as he spoke of social cuts in Mali and Senegal. Under IMF conditions, governments had slashed budgets for schools and hospitals. "Children in Mali go hungry while clinics in Dakar decay," he said. "You call it fiscal discipline, we call it cruelty." Fourth, he recalled the devaluation of Nigeria's naira in 1986, an IMF-imposed reform that crushed the middle class overnight. "Our currencies were broken," he said, "not by markets, but by masters." Fifth, He turned to Liberia and Sierra Leone, nations where IMF loans flowed freely into corrupt systems, enriching elites while citizens inherited mountains of debt. "We were told it was aid," Traoré thundered, "but aid that serves corruption is not charity, it is control." Sixth, his voice slowed. "In my own country, Burkina Faso," he said, "we were told to export raw gold, not to refine it. We watched our land stripped, our people left with dust. Profit fled abroad, leaving only scars." Seventh, he pointed to Niger, where IMF programs forced the government to open its electricity and telecom sectors to foreign ownership. In the process, he said, Niger lost control over its lifeline, its own power. Every sentence landed like a hammer on the marble floor. Delegates shifted, pens stopped moving, journalists scribbled furiously. Then he paused, looked up from his notes, and said softly, "This is not about money. It is about honor, about the dignity of Africa." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if one continent had taken a breath together, the African delegation stood. Applause erupted, loud, rolling, unstoppable. IMF officials sat motionless, their silence louder than any speech. The thunder of clapping hands filled the chamber. Reporters rushed out of the room, typing headlines in panic and awe. "Traoré defies IMF. Africa finds its voice." Outside the hall, cameras captured a sight few had seen before, African ambassadors embracing, their faces wet with tears. In that moment, the poorest nation in the world had humbled the richest institutions on earth. But even as applause roared, a shadow loomed. History has known many Davids who stood against Goliath. Few survived the battle. Was this courage or suicide? Only time would tell. The applause did not end inside the marble walls of the United Nations. It traveled. It became an echo that crossed oceans, deserts, and villages. Within hours, Africa was alive with the sound of something new, pride. In Mali, an old radio crackled in a dusty market. A crowd gathered as Traoré's words replayed on the air. Mothers stood still, holding baskets of grain, listening to a man who finally spoke what they had always felt. "Africa owes you nothing." One woman whispered to her child, "He speaks for us all." In Accra, students filled university halls, debating the 7 crimes of the IMF. Some quoted Sankara, others quoted scripture. One said, "It's not just a speech, it's a declaration." Across the continent, on chalkboards, walls, and banners, 3 words appeared again and again. Dignity, not money. In Ouagadougou, murals began to bloom overnight. Artists painted Traoré beside Thomas Sankara, 2 soldier presidents bound by faith and defiance. Streets erupted with music and chanting. It wasn't protest, it was awakening, but joy and fear walked hand in hand. Analysts on television warned that the IMF could strike back, not with armies, but with hunger. Aid could be frozen, credit could tighten, markets could punish entire nations for one man's words. In the corridors of power, officials whispered about retaliation. "He has gone too far," said one Western diplomat. "He will pay for this." Yet in cafes and classrooms, Africans said the opposite. "He has gone far enough." In Washington, the State Department issued a cautious statement calling Traoré's speech reckless and destabilizing. The press repeated it with concern. But outside government walls, a very different America listened. At Howard University, students gathered to replay the moment on giant screens. Professors compared Traoré's words to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. In Harlem, pastors quoted him in Sunday sermons. "This is not about money. It is about honor." Congregations rose to their feet. Choirs sang hymns of freedom, blending gospel with the rhythm of Africa. In Atlanta, one preacher said, "The cry for dignity is the same whether in Harlem or Ouagadougou." Across social media, African Americans shared his image. The young soldier with his hand raised toward power. The hashtag number sign DIGNITYNOTMONEY trended from Lagos to Los Angeles. For the first time in decades, Africa's message was not one of crisis, but of courage. In Paris and Brussels, commentators were uneasy. The French media called the speech dangerously nationalistic. European officials urged stability and dialogue. But beneath the diplomatic words was a tremor of fear. The fear that Africa was waking up, and their control was slipping away. In Moscow, state television called him the voice of the new world. In Beijing, commentators praised him as a partner in progress. Both powers saw opportunity where the West saw rebellion. They offered loans without conditions, investment without interference. Inside Africa, these offers sparked debate. Was this the path to independence, or merely a new kind of dependence? As night fell over West Africa, the mood was electric, yet uncertain. In Lagos, young activists marched through crowded streets holding banners painted in red and gold, "Africa owes nothing." In Ghana, students posted online essays asking whether their government should revisit its $3 billion IMF bailout. And in Ouagadougou, the celebration turned spiritual. Market women lit candles in the streets. Soldiers saluted passing civilians. Children painted the word dignity on school walls. The air smelled of smoke, dust, and hope. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso's presidential palace, the mood was quieter. Ministers gathered in the dim light, debating the cost of defiance. Some warned that sanctions could cripple the economy. Others said that freedom was worth the hunger. Traoré listened silently. Then he stood and said, "A nation that fears hunger more than humiliation will never be free." Outside, the crowds sang. Across the continent, hearts beat faster. A storm was coming, but so was something greater: the return of pride. Still, the question loomed like a shadow over the celebration. Could dignity survive when the hunger bills arrive? The applause that began in New York had become a wave, but waves can lift, and they can drown. In the days that followed, the applause faded into whispers, and the whispers turned into calculations. Numbers began to move, quietly, ruthlessly, across computer screens in London, Paris, and New York. Investors were uneasy. Banks hinted at raising interest rates on African loans. Some paused transactions altogether. Aid agencies warned that international programs could shrink. The celebration in Ouagadougou had turned into anxiety in the capital's ministry halls. Burkina Faso's finance minister held a press conference. His voice trembled as he tried to calm the markets. "Our economy remains stable," he said. But everyone knew what he didn't say: that the IMF's silence was its most dangerous weapon. In the dusty markets of Ouagadougou, traders whispered about prices climbing overnight. A bag of rice cost twice as much. Fuel stations ran dry. But amid the uncertainty, something unexpected happened. The people refused to panic. A woman selling grain said, "If poverty is the price of freedom, we will pay it." Her words spread like wildfire. They were repeated in the villages, in churches, in schools. Teachers, unpaid for months, wrote Traoré's words on chalkboards. "This is about dignity, not money." Soldiers at checkpoints greeted travelers with new pride. The old sense of helplessness was fading, replaced by a fragile but powerful hope. In Parliament, opposition leaders demanded an emergency session. Some called for reconciliation with the IMF. Others accused Traoré of leading the nation toward economic suicide. But when the cameras turned on him, Traoré's message was unwavering. Freedom is never given. It is claimed, and those who fear its cost are not ready for it. His words struck a nerve. Across the Sahel, in Niger, Mali, and Guinea, leaders quietly discussed forming a united front, a new alliance that would demand fairer terms from the IMF. Some diplomats called it the Sahel Sovereignty Bloc. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened a special session. For the first time in decades, the question wasn't how much aid Africa would receive, but how much control it could reclaim. The proposal was bold: an African Sovereignty Fund, a shared pool of resources to replace foreign dependency. Yet even unity came with fear. What if aid vanished before the fund could be born? What if hunger arrived before hope could take root? Outside of politics, ordinary families faced the first real consequences. Prices soared. Hospitals lacked medicine. Students walked out in protest, not against their government, but in support of it. They carried signs that read, "We can endure hunger. We cannot endure humiliation." Internationally, the media split in two. Western outlets ran headlines like "Burkina Faso on the brink" and "Traoré's gamble threatens Sahel stability." But African and diaspora media painted a different picture. The age of dignity begins. In Washington, policy analysts worried. For decades, the IMF had been a quiet instrument of influence. Now that control was slipping. If one small country can defy us, one think tank report warned, others might follow. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the news was met with applause. Russian and Chinese officials offered new loans and partnerships, without strings, they said. But in private, their motives were clear. Every empire seeks a new frontier. Inside Burkina Faso, the government wrestled with a cruel paradox. The more the world turned away, the more united its people became. Churches were full, hymns mixed with patriotic songs. In markets and mosques, people spoke the same line: "We own nothing. We stand for dignity." That unity was more powerful than any sanction. Still, the cost was real. Hunger began to bite. Fuel shipments slowed. Civil servants went unpaid. Mothers lined up for hours at bakeries, clutching coins that bought less each day. At night, Traoré met with his advisors. The candles flickered on a wooden table covered with maps and reports. One minister pleaded, "Mr. President, if we don't yield, our people will starve." Traoré's eyes were weary, but steady. "If they starve," he said, "let it not be in silence." He paused, looking out the window toward the dark city. "Empires fall," he whispered, "but dignity endures." Hy vọng le loi, tiếng gió lướt qua như tượng trưng cho tinh thần bất khuất. For the first time in generations, the people of Burkina Faso were united not by fear, but by faith. Faith in something greater than comfort, stronger than fear. And as the world watched, another question began to rise, one that no economic model could answer. Can a nation survive on pride alone? Far beyond the borders of Africa, the world was watching and calculating. In Washington, the mood was tense. The State Department called Traoré's remarks reckless and destabilizing. Behind closed doors, the language was sharper. "We built these institutions," one official said. "If they fall, our influence falls with them." At think tanks and policy tables, analysts debated the same question. Was Africa's rebellion contagious? Some argued it was symbolic, a spark that would fade. Others feared it was the beginning of a wave that could sweep across the developing world, toppling decades of quiet control. The IMF, though silent in public, moved swiftly in private. Meetings were held in New York and Geneva. Reports were drafted on credit risk, aid restructuring, and containment. The message was clear. If Burkina Faso's defiance spread, the global financial order could fracture. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe trembled. In Paris, commentators called Traoré's speech dangerous populism. They worried that centuries of French influence in West Africa were unraveling. In Brussels, EU officials issued statements of concern and stability, but diplomats privately admitted that something had shifted. Africa was no longer begging, It was bargaining. In the global south, however, the tone was different. In Moscow, state media called Traoré a revolutionary heir to the anti-colonial struggle. In Beijing, officials praised him as a voice for sovereignty, quietly offering new credit lines through Chinese banks. No political conditions, they said, though everyone knew there are always strings, only hidden deeper. Even in Latin America, commentators drew parallels to past debt rebellions. From Caracas to Buenos Aires, newspapers asked whether this was Africa's second independence. In the United States, something remarkable unfolded outside of government. At Howard, Morehouse, and Spelman universities, African American students organized forums called the Dignity Dialogues. Professors compared Traoré's words to the Boston Tea Party, a revolt not against taxation but financial servitude. In churches across Atlanta, Detroit, and Harlem, pastors quoted him like scripture. This is about dignity, not money. The congregation stood and clapped. Some wept. Some whispered prayers for Africa. And so, the irony became clear. While governments saw threat, ordinary people saw hope. The same message that frightened the powerful had awakened the faithful. Across the world, television screens flickered with his image, a soldier president standing alone before marble pillars, finger raised in defiance. Some called him reckless, others called him righteous, but everyone, friend or foe, agreed on one thing. Africa had spoken, and the world could no longer ignore it. The stage was no longer financial, it was moral. And in this new arena, no superpower could claim control. The question now was simple. Would the great powers crush this fire, or would they fan it into flame? The image remains, etched forever in the memory of a generation. A young soldier president standing tall in the chamber of the United Nations. His finger raised, his voice steady, his words cutting through decades of silence. Africa owes you nothing. Those 7 words traveled farther than any bullet, deeper than any speech. They crossed deserts, seas, and hearts. They awakened something long forgotten, a sense that dignity itself could be a form of wealth. Across the world, some dismissed him as reckless, others feared him as a threat. But in the quiet corners of Africa, in schools, in churches, in markets, the message took root. A teacher in Ghana wrote it on the blackboard. This is about dignity, not money. A mother in Mali whispered it to her son at bedtime. We owe nothing. And in the streets of Ouagadougou, children sang it as if it were a national hymn. The consequences were real. Prices rose, aid wavered, pressure built. Yet through the hardship, something sacred survived. Hope. Hope that maybe, for the first time, Africa was writing its own story. In a late-night address broadcast to a weary nation, Ibrahim Traoré stood again, the same calm in his eyes. We do not ask permission to be free, he said. We have risen to claim it. The camera zoomed in on his face, tired but unbroken. Behind him, the flag of Burkina Faso fluttered in the still air. Freedom is never free. It demands a price, sometimes measured not in gold, but in hunger, in patience, in faith. But there are things a nation cannot buy back once lost: its soul, its dignity, its pride. So tonight, as the world debates numbers and interest rates, one question remains for each of us. Would you endure hunger for the sake of dignity? If your answer is yes, if these words move something within you, leave just one word below. Dignity. Let the world see that you heard him. Let history record that when one man spoke truth to power, you did not look away. Because on that October day in New York, the silence was broken, and from the smallest landlocked nation in Africa, came a roar that reached the heavens. God bless Burkina Faso. God bless Africa. And God bless every soul who still believes freedom is worth the fight.